Carol. I'm going to turn now to what I'm going to refer to as your campaigning work, but obviously that encompasses a wide range of different activities, which I hope we'll pick up on examples of all of them in the course of the rest of the day. Now, you and Pete, in the years before his death, from 1994 onwards, you were jointly involved in campaigning together.
Very much so, yes.
And as I understand your statement, there were two particular triggers for you and he both starting to look beyond what was happening to Pete and look more widely. The first was the way in which Pete learnt he was hepatitis C positive.
Yes.
And the alarm bells that went off in your head at the absence of pre- and post-test counselling, is that right?
Yes, they were the triggers, yes.
And then the other was when you then wanted to find out more about this, the realisation that undertaking waiver, whatever term one wants to use, the agreement not to sue as part of the compromise of the HIV haemophilia litigation, placed a significant impediment in the way of being able to take any legal action.
Yes, because the implications dawned on us what Pete had signed, and obviously talking to Pete and talking to other people, we realised that they'd signed not knowing that they had hepatitis C, not knowing that it was a very serious condition. And, you know, we wondered, well, why is it in an HIV litigation? So lots of alarm bells were going, yeah.
And those two things, that the absence of counselling, the idea that Pete had been tested without his consent and without the implications being explained, and then the realisation that the settlement prevented legal action, those were the two events that really led you and Pete to start looking much more widely, digging deep to try and find out more.
Absolutely, because we were thinking, well, you know, what don't we know about the HIV litigation? Are there other things that we, you know, haven't been told? So yes, so one of the first things we did was to go back to the original HIV solicitors and to try and get more information.
Now, after Pete's death, and notwithstanding your own significant health problems, you have continued your campaigning activities tirelessly. What is it that's kept you going or led you to keep going, notwithstanding the enormous personal cost to you?
Because I wanted answers for everybody. Because if I can describe, haemophilia is a bit like a big family, and it can be dysfunctional at times, but there was a core group of us that were in touch. And in many ways, haemophiliacs are in contact with each other all their lives, because quite often they'll go to like Trelaws together, they'll be at the same treatment centres together, they'll go to each other's weddings together. They used to go on the Haemophilia Society caravan holidays together. So this was a group of people that was like a big extended family. And you know, they became my family, and I wanted to find answers not only for Pete but for other people as well, and that was his motivation.
Now, before we look at some of the specific things that you wrote or discovered or did, I just want to look at some of what other people have said about your work. You produced a master's dissertation. We're going to look at the dissertation in a little while and look at some of what you recorded there. But you were awarded a specific prize for that in 2009, is that right?
I was, yes.
And it was the Economic and Social Research Council's Michael Young Prize.
It was, yes.
You started work on that dissertation, I think, very soon after Pete's death.
I did. Pete died in the April, and I started university in the September. But in a way, what kept me going was I thought, I've already started this research in an informal way, and I just need to put it into a formal setting. And I thought then it might be taken more seriously, because as so-called amateurs, you know, bearing in mind I wasn't working, so I didn't have that kudos of having a career, we weren't taken seriously. And that was a way I thought that we could get something out and be taken more seriously.
And you also say in your statement that one of the reasons for embarking upon it so soon after Pete's death was you wanted to carry on with what you and Pete had started in terms of the research and the work that you'd done together?
Absolutely, there was no question, because this was the unfinished business, and I had many discussions before Pete died. I knew what he wanted, and I made a promise to him, and I was going to keep that promise.
And you said it was also gave you a focus and a temporary distraction from trauma, and you say guilt in your statement. Why did you feel guilty?
Yeah, I think I felt guilty that you can never do enough. You know, I always wanted to do more. Things were out of control, out of my control. I was very distressed, you know, obviously about how his life ended, and I know he didn't think that, but I was worried I'd let him down.
Important also to recognise that you and Pete, I think, had received a joint life award from the Committee of 10,000.
Yes.
What's the Committee of 10,000 for those who don't know?
That's 10,000 haemophiliacs in the US that were also infected with HIV and hepatitis C. And from the 90s, we got in contact with some of these campaigners. One who unfortunately has died, but was at the head of things, called Corey Dubin, and he's public, so yes, I can say his name. And we learned such a lot from them. They were a great support because, of course, they knew more about pharmaceutical companies, about the American treatment, and, you know, they helped us. And so they... Peter died by then, but they invited me to a conference in Washington, D.C. And at that conference was, you know, some amazing people, one being Don Francis, who he was at the Center for Disease Control, and he warned about the dangers of the US treatment and tried to make changes. And another one was Jay Epstein. So I was I was very honoured to be in their company because, you know, they were whistleblowers, and because of what they'd achieved.
And then I also want to look at an observation from Lord Morris in Parliament. HSOC 0002256, please, Lawrence. And whilst we're waiting for that, we've had a lot of reference to Lord Morris's name over the last few weeks. He was Alf Morris,
he was
MP, became Lord Morris. And again, a tireless campaigner for the disabled, the disadvantaged, and he took up the particular cause of those with haemophilia who'd been infected. He
was fantastic, and he was our friend. And he hadn't come from easy circumstances, you know, himself, you know, with his father. I think his father had had a disability. So he came from that personal experience. He was tireless, and even right up to the end of his life, he would turn up at Parliament in, you know, you could see visibly he was in a lot of discomfort, and he never stopped. And he is, you know, he's a hero to us, you know, our friend that was by our side and walked down Downing Street with us, and he phoned us before each debate and got the latest information. And I don't want him to be forgotten, because I mean, if we look at all the debates, we wouldn't even be here if Alf hadn't done those debates.
And this is an extract from Hansard, April of 2009. We can see the debate is headed to call attention to the findings of the independent public inquiry headed by Lord Archer. For present purposes, I just want to look at something Lord Morris says on, should be page 4, please, Lawrence. I might need to look at the whole page just to work out where it is. Yes, so if we can zoom in on the top half of the page. It's under the heading column 1611, where he says this: the history of the contaminated blood disaster has been described as one of a gallery of heroes locked in an unequal struggle with terminal illness and the power of executive government. That is so, but there is also a gallery of heroines left widowed and bereaved by the disaster. I reflect in particular today on the courage, constancy and tireless campaigning of wives and mothers such as, and then there are a number of names that listed, some of which we've redacted just out of an abundance of caution. It may be in truth they're names that can be public, but we see there the tireless campaigning of wives and mothers such as Carol Grayson, Colette Wintle, all of whom belong in that gallery. And we'll talk about Colette, and obviously the inquirers already heard from her.
Could I just say one thing, Jenny, as well? Also, there's a person sort of missing because he's unusual in that he's a male partner, and obviously most haemophiliacs are male, but there are some like Colette that are female. And in that gallery, although it's not a female, is Colette's husband, Steve.
Yes. And then, if I just read the next paragraph as well to complete it. In none of the many parliamentary campaigns I've been closely involved in over 45 years in Parliament, even thalidomide vaccine damage and those nearly 40 years ago for statutory recognition of dyslexia and autism, have I had so strong a sense that no campaigning should ever have been necessary to right the wrongs suffered by the haemophilia community. Support for their cause, as I believe this debate will demonstrate again, is everywhere seen today as an issue not of right and left, but of right and wrong. Just picking up on that idea of the gallery of heroines, Carol, that's been a theme of a lot of your work over the years, looking at the position of women.
Yes.
Either those, the smaller number of women themselves infected through treatment as a result of a bleeding disorder, or those who have been the carers, the supporters, the bereaved.
Yes, absolutely.
And one of the senses, I think, which emerges from a lot of your work and from your statements is the idea that quite often they're overlooked.
Yes, I mean, as in society in general, there's an element of misogyny. And I think with the majority of haemophiliacs being male, the sort of females that are involved have, do get overlooked. And to that end, at one point, my friend Colette and I went to Anne Milton and we presented 70 pages on gender justice to try and highlight that, we're not appendages. We are, women in our own right. We do our own work. And it's only, I think, about 3 years ago that female haemophiliacs were actually acknowledged properly for the first time, which is incredible. So Colette's gone through her whole life having to argue that she's actually a haemophiliac, even with some of the male haemophiliacs. I mean, I was with her once where, a male haemophiliac confronted her and said, well, you're not haemophiliac, you're not proper haemophiliac. So, there's been that level of denial, which we wanted to put that right.
And we'll look later today in more detail at that meeting with Anne Milton. We can take that down, thank you. Now, your own background, we were touched on earlier, but I just wanted to come back to now. Your own background had been in nursing.
Yes. And
you qualified as a registered mental nurse.
I did, yes.
And you worked in the 80s with some of the first patients diagnosed with AIDS in the United Kingdom. Can you just tell us a little about that experience?
Yes, it was actually very frightening initially because when we first heard, at that point we didn't even know if it could be bloodborne. So if you see what's happening with COVID now, it's almost, in many ways a reflection of what happened then. So, for example, the domestic staff were threatening to sort of walk out because they were so terrified. So we as nurses had to allay that fear and show them that if they followed certain procedures, they would be safe and they could, look after the patients. And we wanted to be as kind and caring and empathetic, to these young people that were being diagnosed. And it was very hard because in those early days we saw a lot of deaths. There wasn't treatment then, a lot of stigma. So we saw young people that were dying whose families didn't know that they were infected. And we tried, although it was very distressing, we tried to be cheerful and, keep a very positive atmosphere, which under the circumstances was exceptionally difficult.
And you had involvement in pre- and post-test counselling in relation to Hgld3, HIV testing.
Yes, yes.
What can you tell us about that?
Well, as a unit, we got together because there were some guidelines from government at the time saying that it was important that, that there was informed consent. So we decided how we were going to proceed in a practical way, and there was a form devised that had to be signed. So what you would do is you would sit down with the patient and you would say, would you like to be tested for HIV? These are the implications. These are the positives of being tested. You know you're positive. You can, you can take a choice and not infect other people. You can take care of your own health. The negative side is it could seriously affect your insurance. It's probably going to make you very depressed. At the moment, there's no treatment. So you came to that decision through counselling, and then they would say yes or no. The test would go away. And in those days, I think it took sometimes about 3 weeks of real anxiety for the patients. And then it would come back, and if it was negative, great. And then if it was positive, you then had to pass that on to them, which was very distressing, and then try and be positive and work out, where you went from there, which again was very difficult because there were very few positives that you could actually give. There was no treatment then.
You also, I think, had some international experience through travelling abroad of the stigma and prejudice faced by people with AIDS elsewhere in the world.
Yes, I did. I was invited in 1987 to go to the old Soviet Union as part of the UK-USR medical exchange programme. And at the time, they were only admitting to 7 official cases in the whole of the Soviet Union, but there were, clearly we found out there were a lot more. And there was a huge amount of stigma, and it was regarded as, quote, a problem of the decadent West, so about perceptions. And we'd met the doctors in London, and it had gone really well, and we were invited back. But the country was just opening up, and it was the time of glasnost and perestroika. So this was almost like a test for health, that we could go in and work on an equal level with, our Russian counterparts and learn from each other. And one of the things, for example, I got a chance to interview some soldiers that they were at risk of AIDS. They'd become addicted to drugs while they were fighting in Afghanistan. And it was actually a massive problem, addiction in the Soviet army. But as you can imagine, politically, nobody wanted to admit to this. So they were looking at ways of how can they deal with AIDS. There was also big stigma against gay people. So it was all about education and trying to trying to get people to look at the prejudice and change the way of thinking.
And how did both your general nursing background and your specific experience of working with people with HIV and AIDS, how did that influence and shape your campaigning work or help your campaigning work?
Well, I already had quite a bit of background knowledge, and I'd lost the fear personally. So it wasn't so difficult for me because I'd sort of try and I'd led by example in nursing. I felt that I should go public because some people had to go public in order to change things. So that was very important to speak out publicly as soon as I possibly could. But it was still frightening.
Now, you and Pete set up your own campaigning body. I think it was initially called Hemophilia North.
It was, yes.
And then it became Hemophilia Action UK.
Yes.
And you formed ties with a lot of the regional papers. So the Newcastle Journal, the Northern Echo, the Hartlepool Mail,
yes.
Some of those. And those are links which I think you retained over many years. You've listed in some of the multiple articles published in those newspapers over the years. How important was that link with the regional papers and the ability to pursue campaigns on a regional basis?
It was huge because at the time the mainstream media, when we'd ring up and say, are you interested in a story, they'd say, well, it's a dead story, it's all been covered, there's nothing new. And there was an excellent journalist called Llewellyn Holdcroft, a really good a local investigative journalist. And I'd written in response to a letter a gentleman called Dr. Harash Narang had written on CJD. She saw the letter and said she'd like to meet me. because she didn't know about the haemophilia issue. And when we met, she said, we'd like to run she discussed it with the paper, and they would like to run a joint campaign, which became the Bad Blood campaign and started in 2000. And it was incredible because she took such risks. But everything, the really good thing from our point of view was everything went by the lawyers of the paper, because it was so controversial at the time. And we broke story after story in the North East. And then later, they would be picked up in Scotland and picked up, here in mainstream media.
And you said in your statement there were 3 main areas of work for Haemophilia Action UK. The first was research, which you've described as establishing what had happened, who knew what and when, whether there had been wrongdoing, and where so collecting evidence of it. And we'll look at some examples of that, obviously. But that was the first strand of the organisation's work. The second was involvement in litigation. And you've described that as refusing to accept that haemophiliacs had all they were going to get in 1991, pursuing legal proceedings where necessary to gain financial recognition of the wrongs done to haemophiliacs, to establish the facts and truth of what had happened, to hold the government to account where it continued to peddle untruths. And you were involved, the organisation was involved with not just direct litigation that, say, you or Peter brought, but with assisting others bringing litigation.
Yes, absolutely.
And then the third main area of work, and this is the one I wanted to ask you about next, was support. You said supporting infected haemophiliacs with terminal illnesses and their partner carers and bereaved families on an emotional, personal and one-to-one basis.
Yes.
And did that reflect the fact that there was a gap? There was a lack of availability of such support? Absolutely.
People just didn't know who to turn to. And I guess because I'd had a counselling role, I sort of took that on. And I mean, for years, we would have people ringing us day and night. You know, if something happened in the middle of the night at 3 in.the morning, they would ring us. And we said, you can ring us at any time. You know, but obviously that's very difficult as well. It's very stressful. But we wanted to give that support, and we wanted to help them to find a route, because they wanted to know more, but they didn't know how to go about it in a practical way, how to get medical records, who to contact. I mean, all of this started in the days before freedom of information, before social media, and it was really hard to get in touch with people because we'd have to leave messages at the Macfarlane Trust, and with our name and address, and say if anybody wants to contact us, this is how you can do so, because there was such stigma, and obviously there was a confidentiality aspect. So nowadays on social media, it's so easy, and with freedom of information, there's a whole process. We didn't have that. Everything was snail mail. It cost a fortune to mail things out to people, which we did.
I think we get a flavour of the early work of Haemophilia North from WITN 1055015. And it says in the first paragraph, we're 2 haemophiliacs and 1 partner who've recently set up Haemophilia North for any haemophiliac or person with a bleeding disorder who is virally infected and their family members or partner who wish to join us in supporting and sharing information with each other. We felt the above was a need that was not being met in the North East. We recognise as our numbers grow smaller, our voices need to be stronger. We formed this group because we realised how isolated we had become, with no one in a similar situation with which to talk about our difficulties living with viruses. Haemophilia North is not connected with any other organisation. The following are what we hope to share and achieve. And then we've got a list, and again, it gives I think a good insight into some of the practical stuff you were trying to do, Carol.
Yes.
Update on recent HCV settlements and legal action. Treatment update with regard to recombinant. Support network. Telephone and email helpline. Monthly update by newsletter. Social nights for the affected and separate nights for partners and family to be followed by a social for all. Information on complementary therapies and local facilities. Macfarlane Trust feedback. 2 of us are on the partnership group. Talks by Haemophilia Society HIV and HCV workers, how the 18 remaining can help progress treatment and related issues, Arrangements can be made to visit those who are unable to attend meetings. So a very practical, supportive approach in terms of this aspect of your work.
Yes, and the 18 refers to the 18 that were at that time alive in the northeast.
Now, you've already alluded to one of those with whom you've closely worked over the years, Colette and her husband, Stephen.
Yes.
One of the other people who you worked with over a number of years, you and Pete, was Peter Mossman.
Absolutely,
Mossy.
yes. Mossy, yes.
And I think we get a sense, and again, there's no need to be concerned about mentioning his name. It's a matter of public record. If we look at a document from him, just to, again, a little bit of his voice, WITN 1055018. This is a letter from Mossy to the Reverend Tanner. This is dated November 1994, and it just gives a flavour of some of the issues that were of concern at that time, so I'm going to read it out. Dear Alan, may I first start by thanking you and the Society for a really wonderful weekend at Coventry. However, I'm writing to you now in my own right and not as a member of the Manor House group, and I write in anger and also sadness. And Mossy was instrumental in relation to the Manor House group, as I understand it.
Absolutely, he was a co-founder, yes.
As I'm sure you've seen for yourself at the drop-in meeting at Coventry on hepatitis, the amount of anger and frustration which was running very high at the meeting, anger and frustration which I myself feel. I feel that the Society is its own worst enemy, and unless the Society changes its ways drastically, it's going to open a Pandora's box. As I'm sure you're well aware, over the last 5 years, I've been bombarding the Society constantly with letters, with regards, help and support for people with hepatitis, only to be told and made to feel that I was the only person in the Society that seemed to be having problems. You can imagine how upset and angry I was after talking to other members at the drop-in group, only to find out that I was far from being on my own. I was even more hurt and upset when it was brought to my attention that several other members were also told by the Society, i.e. that they were the only ones having problems. This I find to be totally unacceptable. This is the sort of behaviour you would expect from health authorities and the government, not by a society that claims to represent people with haemophilia and whose motto is caring for people with haemophilia. Another serious point I would like to emphasise is with regard to centre directors and liver specialists, withholding information from the patient regarding her illness from hepatitis. I myself know of several cases where the patient only found out long after the doctors knew of their infection, in some cases years after. In one case, the patient only found out when he was informed by the doctor he did not have long to live, even though his doctor knew he had been infected for 4 years. This is a disgrace and is one area where the Society can and should do something to remedy this appalling situation. Now, I draw attention to that not specifically because of what was said about the Haemophilia Society, but because it would appear from this that in the mid-90s, the discovery of infection with hepatitis C, the lack of support for hepatitis C, the lack of knowledge about hepatitis C, that was one of the core issues you and Pete and Mossy and Colette and Stephen were trying to find out more about.
Exactly, because I knew from my nursing that it was a serious condition. And I couldn't understand for the life of me how haemophiliacs had not been told, how it could progress. And people didn't seem interested. I mean, we as campaigners campaigned for a year before the Haemophilia Society would take it up as an issue. And one of the things that Mossy brought to light in, it would have been, I think, 1991 or 2, there were some minutes from the Haemophilia Society, and they had actually asked 2 people to look at hepatitis C to see what were the implications. They went away and came back and basically said nothing further needs to be done at this time. And we spent a whole year from 94 to 95 trying to persuade the Society to campaign, because that was our body. We needed their support, we needed them to be there. And we felt that, I mean, from 94 to 95 was an awful year. We felt really abandoned.
Now, I'm going to turn, if we can take that down, thank you now, to some aspects of the research work which you undertook. If we can... sorry, I'm just going to try and find the reference. Yes, I want to pick this up by reference to one of your statements. So WITN 1055004. And if we could go to page 27, you refer in paragraph 98 to your dissertation. We'll look at that in a moment. But I just wanted to pick up, again, what you say in your statement on this general theme about gender bias.
Yes.
Because that's been an important part of your work. So bottom of the page, haemophilia tends to be largely associated with men and women identified as carriers of the haemophilia gene mutation. At this point, with regard to research, I want to point out the importance of looking at gender differences during research. It is only recently women with haemophilia have been officially recognised and consideration given to how bleeding may affect them in terms of menstruation, childbirth and the menopause. There is also a recognised gender bias in carrying out medical research, and you've there set out a number of quotations from a recent article, March 2021 article in The Guardian. And then you say this in your statement about the dissertation. My dissertation research and questionnaires covered men and women with haemophilia, and also looked at how predominantly, but not exclusively, female partners were viewed and treated, which included means testing of financial trust payments, and how the losses of women who cared for haemophiliacs with HIV and hepatitis viruses were viewed. There were also differences in how infected female partners were assessed, given that they often had a carer role also. Women would be seen as born carers and excused not to examine the loss of their careers when they took on the carer role. There was often an expectation that they would fit into this role. There was, in addition, a reluctance in both the haemophilia community and professionals in recognising women with disabilities, with an often misogynistic attitude that they were somehow less deserving of support, or that men must speak for women, often without understanding their specific needs. My dissertation questionnaires had one for infected haemophiliacs and one for affected partners. So we touched on that earlier, Carol, but I wanted to draw attention to that before we look at the dissertation, because you had that issue that you've talked about very consciously in mind when you worked out your methodology for your dissertation research.
I did, and the master's degree was called Gender, Culture and Development. So I was able to put it within the framework of that course.
And before we look at the dissertation itself, can I then pick up, if we go to the next page, please, Lawrence, on some of the practical difficulties with research in the 90s, and in particular, you've touched on this already in your evidence, but if we go to the bottom of the page, you say this: it's important to point out there was no quick fix online research facility in the early days, and I would wait patiently for documents to arrive from the US and Canada from other haemophilia campaigners by snail mail. Prior to social media, as we know it now in terms of Twitter and Facebook, Pete and I learnt the value of exchanging ideas through early chat rooms as the internet developed, such as Free Republic, where we engaged with fellow campaigners in the States and Canada. And then the bottom of the page, you talk about some of the practical experiences you had trying to do research in the Newcastle University Medical Library. You had to pretend to be a medical student for a while. But finally caught out when you attended, and there was a picture of you in the Newcastle Journal on one of the boards.
Yes. And they were actually, to be fair, they were very good to me, and then they gave me a special pass after that.
And then, again, if we go over the page, to page 32, in fact, this time. I just want to read out paragraphs 111 to 113, because, again, I think that they help us understand a lot about your work. I keenly researched all I could get my hands on regarding plasma and plasmapheresis before writing about it. As I started to get to grips with my research findings, the severity and scale of the contaminated blood scandal in the UK haemophilia population became much clearer. I knew that research would be a large part of my role in campaigning, as the material was at times so alarming it was almost hard to believe myself, and I did not want to be dismissed as an unreliable conspiracy theorist. Indeed, this was part of the problem in my early days of campaigning, getting not only the media but haemophiliacs themselves to accept the background to what had happened to them. And for a time, many were in denial, as they had put their absolute trust in those securing and providing factor concentrates. I began by producing brief overviews / timelines, which I would give to lawyers and journalists, such as that produced in 2002. I also collected a library of books on all aspects of blood and blood safety. In addition, I spent hours, as highlighted in medical libraries, researching articles specifically back to the 1950s on haemophilia, hepatitis, and later HIV/AIDS and VCJD. So by the time I went to university, I was already well prepared as a previously self-taught researcher, aided by the fact that I'd worked in an academic library at Newcastle Polytechnic in the 1980s, now the University of Northumbria. Having worked in the nursing and social work department, I also knew my way around the academic journals. So researching at the University of Newcastle Medical Library was simply another step on the ladder. And then this, and this I think is really important. You say this: now when I watch the doctors and scientists giving evidence to the infected blood inquiry, I am already very familiar with much of the evidence from both academic journals and government documents which I accessed years earlier, and know some of these articles like the back of my hand. As far as the research articles go, although the content can be quite grim, it is, in a way, also like being among old friends. The journal studies and old blood policy documents submitted to lawyers during the discovery period of the HIV litigation in 1991, now being used at the inquiry, helped guide my understanding for many years. I think that's an important point, Carol, because we've spent months looking at a number of key documents.
Yes.
The Chimps letter, I think as you referred to it in your statement, the Galbraith letter, which we'll come back to at a later stage of your evidence. Just two examples, but there's obviously many. Am I right in getting the sense from your statement that, as you say there, it's almost like these are almost like old friends? You know these documents so well because you've pored over them for years.
I know the documents, and in the HIV litigation, I know the typeface, the creases, the marks of the, where you would hold them together in a binder. I mean, I sort of just know them. If I see a document, I think, oh, yeah, that's a document I've had in my collection for the last 20, 25 years. And getting access to the HIV litigation documents was a huge breakthrough. And it wasn't done all at once, it was done sort of step by step. But I kept getting responses from the government that all these documents had been destroyed. So to find that there were copies about 10 minutes from my home in a lawyer's office, Pete's old solicitor's office for the HIV litigation, that they still existed was incredible and a complete eye-opener.
Now, you go on in the next paragraph to talk about your dissertation, and that's what I want to turn to, but we'll do that by reference to the dissertation itself. So could we please have WITN 1055006, please? So we can see the title of your dissertation, Blood Flows Not Just Through Our Veins, but Through Our Minds. How has the global politics of blood impacted on the UK haemophilia community? And you submitted that, we can see from the bottom of the page, in 2007. If we just go over the page, the first paragraph emphasises the dedication to Pete. Just wanted to bring that up. And then if we go to the abstract on the next page, it's just over a page. I'm going to read it, Carol, because, again, I think it's a really useful summary of some of what we learned from the dissertation. So I'll read this, and then I want to ask you about some of the different aspects of the document. Many haemophiliacs were infected with HIV and hepatitis viruses during the 1970s and 1980s, following treatment with plasma products in NHS hospitals. This dissertation investigates the politics of the global blood trade by examining blood policy documents from the 1960s to the present day and analyses the impact of these policies on the UK haemophilia community. The study critiques the findings of a government report, Self-Sufficiency in Blood Products in England and Wales, a chronology from 1973 to 1991, Department of Health 2006, which claimed that the benefits of importing US treatment products manufactured from the plasma of remunerated prison and Skid Row donors outweighed the viral risks to patients. A textual analysis of material originating from the Department of Health and other organisations examines the government's failure to achieve self-sufficiency in the manufacture of UK blood products. The anthropological inquiry explores how decisions made by institutions nationally and internationally continue to affect haemophiliacs and their families to this day. The investigation highlights the ethical problems that can arise when blood becomes a commodity and profit is prioritised over safety, and how this is interpreted by those at the receiving end of contaminated treatment. Key themes were identified by examining the replies from questionnaires sent out to haemophiliacs and their partners and illustrate the way in which they've adapted to their current situation. The report concludes that research participants have re-evaluated their personal identity and revised their collective response to as an infected subculture within society to challenge the power of the institutions they deem responsible for the demise of their community. This study recommends that the government commissions a full and open, independent public inquiry into how patients came to be infected through their NHS treatment. Now, obviously, we'll come back to your work over the years pushing for a public inquiry later. But just dealing with the subject matter of the dissertation itself, there were two particular features I wanted to ask you about before we look at some of the extracts from it. So one of the things that you did in your dissertation, as I understand it, and please correct me if I get anything wrong, is you took this Department of Health report,
yes,
the Self-Sufficiency in Blood Products report, and we'll be looking at that document in due course in I think, the autumn of this year in one of our hearings. And you analysed that report, what was there and what was not there.
Yes.
Is that a fair summary?
That's correct, yes. And can I just say briefly that the Self-Sufficiency report came out of a meeting that Colette and I had with Lord Philip Hunt, and in response to that meeting, he said that there would be a document which took several years. So it was always my belief that the more we could get government to talk and present information and evidence, the easier it would be to tackle them.
So your campaigning work with Colette and others was instrumental in getting the government to produce a report.
Yes.
But when it was produced, you ended up having to deconstruct it because of what you perceived to be its inadequacies.
Exactly.
And so that was one part of the dissertation work. Another part of it is the material you elicited through the questionnaires, and then your analysis of the responses that you'd received.
Yes, and what happened, when you do a dissertation at master's level, you're limited by word count. And I realised that if I put a questionnaire in itself, which could have been a dissertation in itself, it wasn't counted into the word count. So it was another way of getting another big batch of information out.
Well, actually, I'm not going to try and summarise what you found there. We'll look at what your findings were. So if we just look at a handful of passages, again, it's a document that obviously has to be read in full to do it full justice. But if we go to page 12, you describe, I think, rather more elegantly than I did, the two main areas of research. So you say, and this is under the extract, my dissertation aims to explore the question, how has the politics of blood impacted on the UK haemophilia community? My study is divided into two main areas of research. The first area of research incorporates textual analysis to critique a government report covering blood policy documents from 1973 to 1991 in order to examine the effects on haemophiliacs and their partners. The second area of research involves an anthropological study of the UK haemophilia community through the use of questionnaires to explore haemophilia and partner identity politics and their response to infection with HIV and hepatitis viruses. And then you say this as part of, again, a description of what you yourself were doing. Prior to carrying out my research, I embarked on a comprehensive literature study to identify what had already been written in relation to blood, disability and disease. Several years ago, Dr. Ritzer, Oxford Haemophilia Centre, was asked to comment on the AIDS risk to haemophiliacs through treatment. he answered by stating that the fate of haemophiliacs was in the lap of the gods. And then the reference there to Starr, is that to Douglas Starr's book?
It is, yes.
And then you say this: I wanted to consider this statement alongside a further question: to what extent did the globalisation of blood as a profitable commodity compromise patient safety? So some hugely important themes there.
Yes.
Compressed because of the word count. As you say, you had to find a way to try and encompass these within a document that would meet the criteria of your course.
Exactly, because I mean, I've tried to explain to people that don't, maybe are not familiar with dissertations, that you have to fit the university criteria as well. So you have to have sections on your methodology, on what literature you've read. So I was literally down to one chapter, to put the general information, the most important points into that one particular chapter, which was chapter 4. I actually wrote 80,000 words, and I had to cut it down to maybe about 22,000. So it was actually very difficult, choosing what to keep in and what to leave out.
And can we then pick up just, I think this is from chapter 4. So chapter 4 starts on page 38. This is the section with the critique of the Self-Sufficiency report. And you explain some of the background to the commissioning of that report on that page. If I pick it up at page 41, bottom of the page, I just want to start here, again, read a section and then ask you to comment on it. So you say, my critique of this report is not only a review of the written content of the SSR, that's the Self-Sufficiency report, but is also a textual analysis of some of the material that is excluded. I examine the politics of deceit by deconstructing the government version of the truth, namely the presentation of erroneous information as accurate fact, and by challenging the view that this narrative must be accepted simply because the report emanates from an official body. Although I interpret evidence up to 1991, I've chosen to focus mainly on documents before 1985. This was the period prior to the introduction of heat treatment, at a time when haemophiliacs were most at risk of becoming infected, although you go on there to note the ongoing transmission of hepatitis C through whole blood transfusions. And then picking it up in the next paragraph, it is argued that the SSR, which is described by the author as at times contradictory and incomplete, is written in a way that makes it difficult for some haemophiliacs and non-healthcare professionals to understand. This is an example of the power of language used by professionals to control laypersons, as identified in the work of Foucault, who described the politico-medical hold on a population where the physician places himself as the expert in an almost unquestionable position of authority. The SSR, which was supposed to address questions from the haemophilia community, makes extensive use of politico-medical terminology to disempower and confuse the reader. It is not difficult, however, for educated and informed campaigners to dissect the content and see through the government's diversion tactics of focusing on pages of facts and figures of treatment output, which could have easily been summed up in one word: a failure in terms of self-sufficiency, whilst government downplayed the key issue of safety. The sourcing of evidence, and you're referring here to the evidence that was sourced for the self-sufficiency report,
yes,
is poor in that whoever compiled the material for the report, the government's never identified the author, failed to work with other key organisations during the collection of evidence stage, despite the fact that campaigners offered to share their own documents to ensure that the SSR was as accurate as possible. It is argued that this was a deliberate ploy to censor sensitive material. If the government had taken key evidence from campaigners, they would have been forced to acknowledge incriminating material. The author of the SSR chooses a careful selection of extracts from the documents that are presented in the report to avoid showing successive governments in a negative light, and the wider health issues are often hidden. The chronology of events is also incomplete due to the exclusion of key documents, which were, in quotation marks, inadvertently destroyed. I'll come back to the word inadvertently in another context later. But so that's a fairly damning critique, it might be said, of the SSR. Just looking back now reflecting on your dissertation and on the work that you undertook in analysing the self-sufficiency report, has your view changed or wavered since, or do you stand by everything you said here?
I stand even more strongly on what I wrote, yes.
And then, if we can pick up, if we start on page 46, I'm not proposing to read out this page, but you'll see there, Carol, the paragraph beginning prior to the invention of factor concentrate. So you talk there about some of the issues in relation to cryoprecipitate. And you say the fourth line, the government have on many occasions tried to use the argument that had haemophiliacs not been treated with factor concentrates, they might have died from bleeding. And that's obviously a particularly topical theme in light of some of the evidence the inquiry's been examining over the last few weeks. But what I wanted to pick up is the next page, 6 lines down, where it begins, many haemophiliacs have stated that had they known the risks from imported factor concentrates, they would have chosen to remain on cryoprecipitate until such time as a process could be introduced to eliminate hepatitis and later HIV in plasma concentrates, which was eventually the case in the mid-1980s. Haemophiliacs also had a right to abstain from using treatment if they felt the risks were too great. The vast majority of haemophiliacs, however, were never given the information they needed in order to make an informed choice, which is integral to a partnership of trust and respect between doctor and patient, as is pointed out by Fulda. Fulda supports Foucault's work on power inequality in the clinical setting by arguing that if the doctor does not confide in the patient as the patient confides in the doctor, then the relationship is unequal and unjust. It looks there, Carol, as though you've come full circle here. You've come back to the very issue in 1994, one of the very issues that led you and Pete to begin your campaigning work, this issue about the information given to patients, the lack of informed consent. Is that right? Absolutely,
because it was such a big thing in psychiatry, in the area of work that I was working in, that I was just dumbfounded. I couldn't believe how different it was seeing what happened in the world of haemophilia, because all of my work was around informed consent and discussing patient choices and people signing to say that they consented and discussing the pros and cons of treatment, the risks, patients taking responsibility as well for parts of their treatment. So it was very much a sort of as equal as we could make it. The relationship with patient and with the doctors, and it was just complete opposite. It was sort of paternalistic and patriarchal and a very uneven relationship.
And then if we go to page 61, and this is now on a different topic, specifically on what was known about hepatitis is the issue and the risks of hepatitis. You refer on this page to having got a report from Professor Preston, which you asked for as part of litigation that Pete was contemplating. And if we just go a little further down the page, the inquiry obviously knows of Professor Preston and has heard from Professor Preston and looked at his 1978 article, which you know very well, on a number of occasions. But one of the things you did is contrast what Professor Preston was saying with the self-sufficiency report. Is that right, in terms of knowledge of hepatitis risks?
Yes.
And then the quote that you've set out there, even at that time, our patients exhibited a wide spectrum of chronic liver disease, including hepatic cirrhosis. We expressed the view that chronic liver disease was attributable to non-A, non-B hepatitis. We concluded that histological liver disease is common in haemophiliac patients and is probably related to clotting factor concentrate replacement therapy. As I understand it, Carol, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that's an extract from the report that Professor Preston prepared for the litigation Pete was contemplating.
Yes, it was.
And what he's describing is his 1978 research and publication.
Yes.
Then just one last reference in this, and again, it's really just to give a flavour of the wide range of issues which you capture in this. It's page 95. And it's the idea of disempowerment, so it's the bottom half of the page. Participants, now those are those to who you sent the questionnaire and who were completing the questionnaire for you. So I think it's right to understand those would be both haemophiliacs who were themselves infected and partners and family members.
That's correct, yes.
So participants were asked to describe what had disempowered or empowered them in their fight for justice and recognition of their infection. There was a general consensus that fear and prejudice from others disempowered the haemophilia community, as those infected chose to remain anonymous in order to protect themselves and their families. This led to what H16, so that's one of those who'd responded, described as living two lives, a common issue in the haemophilia community where many prefer to keep their viral status hidden, sometimes even from close family members. In some cases, there was also an element of denial or trying to ignore the issues around infection. The pressure from living with HIV, HCV, had in some cases led to marriage breakdown and isolation from the wider community. The majority of participants, however, gained great strength from family and friends that helped to empower them. And then you say this, the depression that arose from constantly seeing fellow haemophiliacs die was disempowering for some as they fought to stay motivated. P12 writes, sadly, the light that once shone bright is now only a flicker struggling to stay alive. Haemophiliacs and partners felt that they'd been disempowered by the medical profession withholding their medical records and failing to allow them informed choice in their treatment. Illness from viral contamination and arthritis and joint damage from haemophilia were also seen as disempowering. The feeling of the unknown led some participants to live life day by day as it was difficult to plan for the future. Self-belief and a need for justice were also strong motivating factors for haemophiliacs and partners to empower themselves. They did this by employing practical solutions, such as utilising the media to highlight their stories, accessing their medical records to educate themselves and others and initiate litigation, and also by fighting for the best possible treatment available. H1 empowered himself by putting posters up in my local hospital to inform people just what had happened to us through contaminated treatment and how the trust and government were actually playing it down. This again challenges the Foucauldian view of the passive patient. Some participants also criticised the Haemophilia Society for not offering enough support and the government and the DSS for not providing enough practical and financial help to those infected. Many within the haemophilia community chose to seek support from others in the same position and empowered themselves by setting up their own campaign organisations and self-help groups. However, there was also a recognition that a lack of cohesion among the groups and difficult agendas had at times disempowered the haemophilia community. And then you go on to discuss what was reported in terms of how people tried to maintain a positive outlook on life. I wanted to read that, Carol, because that's not you offering your perspective, although I think it chimes with your perspective. That's you reporting what had been said by others. Absolutely, as a result of your research.
Yes, and it just reminded me, a memory just came back there, and it was of a haemophiliac who was anonymous, he was afraid of speaking out. And I remember one day he and Pete went to the local hospital, and his sense of empowerment came by. He'd made a poster, and the poster said, this hospital has got obtained, a treatment over the years from American prisons. And he put it on, the little trolley things that transport patients and, bits and pieces around the hospital. He put it on the back of one of those. And it sounds strange, but it was such a big thing for him because he couldn't speak publicly, but he was letting the hospital know that something had gone wrong here. So people found different ways to sort of empower themselves.
And the inquiry's obviously had its own report and oral evidence from the psychosocial group of experts. But the research you've done here is, in a sense, a microcosm, I think, to some extent, of that work.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, obviously, it's been done in much more detail since, but it was a snapshot of what was happening in the haemophilia community at that time. And it's quite useful because I say, sadly, so many have gone, so we've got their voices still there.
we can take that down. So those are the parts of the dissertation I wanted to explore, just to get a flavour of the breadth of it. But obviously it's a document that is required reading, I think, in full in its own right. We touched earlier on some of the difficulties in the early years of research. The practical difficulties. You didn't have everything online. You had to rely upon things coming overseas by post and so on. And you mentioned that you didn't have the Freedom of Information Act. Once the Freedom of Information Act came into force, you started using it as a means of furthering your work. Can you just tell us a little about that?
Yeah, I mean, it was amazing because we now had a mechanism by which to request documents from the government. And in doing that, we got to find out, bit by bit, a bit more about what was happening behind the scenes. Because it's so different to today, where you can put your freedom of information in, and you've got 21 days for a response. And it was amazing when it came in. It was completely changed the way we campaigned, really. Because we knew what we wanted, and we didn't always get what we wanted, but it was a way of trying to obtain that.
Now, you referred earlier to the Bad Blood campaign launched in 2000. And if we just go back to your statement at WITN 1055004, if we go to page 68, please. You explain in paragraph 239 that the Bad Blood campaign with the Newcastle Journal launched on the 5th of August 2000 with the headline, Blood Scandal, Lack of Funding Blamed for Crisis, Doctors Forced to Use US Supplies. And then if we go to the next page, paragraph 242 and 243, you explained this was the start of a long collaborative project between yourself, Luella Holdcroft, the journalist who you referred to a little while ago, and other journal reporters, which broke many contaminated blood stories over the following years. It is important to say that we worked on every single story with the journal, as it was a joint project. I would often provide documents, material I had researched, and suggest who might be good to interview, as with Lord Owen. Luella was an excellent investigative journalist, following leads and writing the stories. We would meet at our home, at the journal offices, or at a cafe in the big market, where each story was discussed and planned in great detail. And because of the nature of the material, this would then go to the newspaper's legal team so it could be checked. Sometimes it delayed stories a little, but I was happy about this. And it was also a safeguard regarding our material, as it was much more difficult for us to be passed off as cranks on the more sensational stories. I've detailed the headlines of each story published simply to give a flavour of content and how often stories appeared. They sometimes came fast and furious, with us getting the headline and sometimes 4 full pages inside, plus the opinion section. Newcastle media was very much a focus for haemophiliacs nationally, who would delight in the fact stories were being heard, and the phone never stopped ringing. And we're just going to get a flavour of some of the articles, bottom of the page. So it's the italicised headlines. Blood scandal, victim who claims he was infected with lethal virus from transmission, wins the right to sue government. And then if we go over the page, we can keep the whole screen up, Lawrence, but we can just see some further examples. This dying man fights a great betrayal. A few survivors gain hope from legal victory. Bad blood, how the scandal developed, and haemophilia fact file. Bad blood explanation needed. Prisoner was turned into killer by proxy. And that's a story from an American campaigner about her brother.
It is. It was a lady called, and we did some work together. Her brother was, he was a prisoner. He was known to have hepatitis C, and he regularly donated to the prison plasma program. And I've got photographs of him as he died, bleeding out, which is not uncommon with hepatitis infection.
And I think amongst the documents that you've provided us with is a letter she wrote to the Prime Minister.
To Tony Blair, yes.
And then blood controversy, experts refute claims over US plasma. Transfusion gave me HIV and hepatitis C. boy died in blood scandal, 11-year-old killed by AIDS virus, and so on. That's just a flavour of some of the work,
yes,
which the newspaper and you and Pete worked on.
Yes.
Can I then just look with you at one letter you wrote? It was to the BMJ. And again, it's, I think, a really good example of some of what you were trying to bring out. So it's at WITN 1055064. So it's a letter from you, do I correctly understand, published in the BMJ in 2000?
Yes, and it was in response to a new an organisation that had set up, which was AVMA. I think it's the Association of Victims of Medical Accidents, I think
yes.
it is. And they were advertising that their work, that they wanted to help people that had been harmed, and I responded because I was hoping that there would be some hope for our community.
And again, I think it's a document that merits reading aloud. So if we just have the text of the... Thank you, Lawrence. So I read with interest the letter you co-wrote to the BMJ's letter page in response to the issue featuring medical error. I saw your professional title and wondered if it was possible I had stumbled across that rare breed, a haematologist with a conscience. I am the coordinator of Hemophilia North, a voluntary group set up to support haemophiliacs infected with HIV and hepatitis viruses and give them a voice. My partner is co-infected HIV and hepatitis B and C. My partner's brother died of AIDS in 1986. The following passage from your letter remains in my mind, and then this is part of what you were responding to.
Yes.
Behind each adverse event, there is a patient, a doctor, and a doctor-patient relationship. A patient must be told when things have gone wrong. Every effort must be made to minimise the after effects, including financial recompense where necessary. Most patients wish to know in detail what happened and what is being done to reduce the possibility of a recurrence. And members of healthcare teams need mechanisms to come to terms with their fallibility. It is hoped that clinical governments will make a difference. So, is it right, Carol, that you were alighting there on what was being said about the importance of people knowing the truth?
Absolutely.
Of knowing what had happened to them?
Yes.
Of knowing why it had happened to them?
Yes.
And in this context here, of knowing what their doctor's participation, knowledge, involvement had been.
Yes, that was really important.
And then you continue, I would be grateful if you could shed some light as to why the above has still not happened with regard to the contamination of haemophiliacs through NHS blood products. This issue was described in the House of Lords this year as the biggest medical treatment disaster in the history of the NHS, yet no public inquiry. I do not hear haematologists standing up and supporting their patients in the fight for a public inquiry. Indeed, there is a wall of silence. Haemophiliacs in England, Scotland and Wales, as in Southern Ireland and Canada, want their day of justice. Indeed, as doctors are well aware, part of the psychological healing process is coming to terms with the truth about what has occurred. Haemophiliacs are unable to move on with what is left of their lives until this happens in an official capacity such as a public inquiry. It has been left up to haemophiliacs and their families to dig for that truth, largely unsupported. The following should leave you in no doubt as to what we are having to confront. And we ask, why haven't the so-called professionals told us the truth? Haemophiliacs not only have to deal with professionals withholding information, but also with professionals inappropriately transferring their anger onto patients because their patients have stumbled onto the truth. And then you itemise, I won't read these out, but you itemise in 10 numbered paragraphs some of the historical narrative, your understanding of what had happened.
Yes.
And if we go to the top of the next page, we can see what we see at the very top of the page, and then paragraph 8 picks up on that issue of hepatitis C, of what people were told of when they were tested and so on. And then I did just want to read paragraph 10 aloud. We are aware that the Department of Health and many haematologists assume all haemophiliacs and their families are stupid and haven't got the intelligence to fathom out why so many haemophiliacs were infected with HIV and hepatitis C and are now dead. This assumption is incorrect. I write to you and your colleagues to ask what support will your group offer haemophiliacs to highlight the issues raised, bringing them to the attention of a wider audience as we are doing, and what support will your group give to help us fight for a public inquiry? Did you get any response, not necessarily from the person or group in question, but more generally to this letter?
Yes, I did have a conversation, and we were the wrong sort of patients. The organisation seemed to be happy to deal with one-off incidents in a clinical setting, such as an example being somebody taken off the wrong leg. But whether this was just so huge and that they, there were new organisations setting up, but they just didn't really want to engage. So we didn't get any support from them. I've spoken to them more recently, but I still think it's a very difficult issue for them to engage on.
Can I then turn to ask you a little about some of the interactions with politicians you've had over the years? We'll pick up after lunch, I think, some of the letters which you've written, in particular seeking a public inquiry to Secretary of State after Secretary of State after Secretary of State. But more generally, you've interacted with lots of politicians over the years.
I have.
And a number of them have been really supportive. Mm-hmm. You've singled out in your statement your MP for many years, Jim Cousins.
Jim Cousins, yes, he was excellent, very supportive. And at one point he got to the stage and he said, in a letter, he said, just sue them, because, they're covering up, you're not going to get answers.
And you also identify with praise in your statement Lord Archer, and we'll come on to the Archer inquiry this afternoon, Lord Morris, who you spoke about earlier, and Lord Owen. And you've had a number of interactions with Lord Owen, David Owen, over the years.
Absolutely. That started when I'd asked Luella if she could interview in around 2000, it would be. And we're still in contact today. I had a message from him just last week. And yes, because we came across some of the same difficulties together. I mean, he had a lot of his documents destroyed, and he wrote to, like I wrote to Health Secretary after Health Secretary, he wrote to Ombudsman after Ombudsman to try and get that addressed. And at one point, because in the HIV litigation, there was a system, which you'll know, a process of discovery where both sides swap evidence. And I found that some of those documents, the documents that he'd needed, still existed, copies of them. So I was at some point able to return some documents to him, and we've kept that, contact over the years.
And then there are those politicians who you've challenged over the years, who you've asked to do something, whether it's a public inquiry or financial support. Now, as I say, we'll look at some individual examples after lunch, but what I wanted to ask you about more generally, first of all, is the overall experience of trying to get answers from the Department of Health, from ministers in the Department of Health. What's your overall experience been?
That from very early on, a standard line was taken. And that was that nobody was negligent, that the best possible treatment was given at the time. And there was a whole series of these statements that we used to joke that they were copy and pasted into every single letter. And no matter what evidence you presented, they wouldn't budge from that line. When we had meetings with them, they didn't minute the meetings. So we realised that we had to minute the meetings because otherwise there'd be no record of what they'd been presented with and what we'd said. But on the whole, I have to say, it was sadly, very negative. There was this sort of set set line that everything, which we might come on to later, that everything was inadvertent. Nothing could have been done differently. And we produced a huge amount of information to the contrary. But until this inquiry, really, there was just nobody wanted to budge. And even now, they will still revert, with all the evidence that's put before them, some of them will still revert back to the old standard lines, no matter how many times we've proven them wrong.
And the impression that one gains from your description of these interactions in your statement and from a number of the letters where you're having to repeat yourself,
yes,
year after year in letter, is the impression is from your perspective coming up against a brick wall.
Absolutely, yes. And it was clear that it was going to be very difficult to get in meetings. And I remember Jim Cousins saying to me once, we'll probably only get one chance, so we've really got to time this, well. They don't want to meet with you. And, I mean, from my point of view, I think it was because if they met with me and, they were presented with evidence, face-to-face meetings and, in discussions, really damning evidence, then they would be expected to address it. So by not meeting with me, they didn't have to address it. By not minuting meetings, they didn't have to address things. So for a long time, nobody would actually meet with me. And I remember one incident with Alan Milburn, and I was due to go on to, it was a news night in Newcastle. Not news night, question time, I think it was. And I'd been vetted for the programme. And at the last minute, I was all due to go, waiting for my taxi, and somebody rang up and said, he won't go on the programme if you're going to be on. I must have had some conversation. So I was so mad, I went down to the studios and I leapt out at him with a bunch of papers, a bunch of documents, because I wanted him to read, what we were trying to say. So people were avoiding me like the plague.
And then, as I say, I want to look at some of the specific letters you wrote after lunch, but just on the theme of having to be dynamic and proactive in some of your actions. You've been involved in demonstrations over the years, the handing in of petitions.
Yes.
And sometimes you've tried to quite graphically convey through posters and placards and blood bags.
Yes.
So can you just tell us about that?
We spoke to some of the staff at the Newcastle Hemophilia Centre that were quite sort of sympathetic, the nurses. And they actually, we said we're going on a demonstration, and we sort of half jokingly said, do you have any blood bags? And they managed to provide some out-of-date blood bags. And we then filled them with a mixture of Ribena and tomato sauce to try and, represent blood. Because with campaigning, it's quite important to have visual, props, really. So we went down to London and we had those blood bags. And I remember the Hemophilia Society, Karen Pappenheim was horrified. I mean, this wasn't blood, that was in the bags. It was just a representation. I mean, there's also been representations using crosses, using coffins, because we needed people to see what we were saying and understand that.
So, note the time. If we could take our lunch break now, because what I want to do next with Carol is look at a number of her letters to the Department of Health over the years, and easier, I think, to do that in one go.
Right.
Yes, I see that. So we'll take a break now. It's 2 minutes to 1 anyway. So we'll take a break until 2 o'clock. Can I just mention one thing for the benefit of those who are here, but also for the benefit of those who are watching online? Don't forget that the British Red Cross are available, and the contact details are on the website, and for those of you who are here, they are here, should anyone wish to use their services. 2 o'clock.
Thank you, sir. Sorry, break. So that Carol's clear, she should not now discuss her evidence, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I think you know that, but
Yes.
Thank you, yes.